Hello everyone, welcome to the 13th lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. As you can see, we are going to complete the 5th week through this lecture today. We are discussing the second part of the modernization theory. In the first part, we have discussed modernization theory, how it postulates that the less developed countries would eventually catch up with the industrialized world, provided they emulated the economic and social systems of or patterns of Western capitalism. And then we have discussed modernization theory in the 4th week. The first part of the modernization theory that through the lens of Hamza Alawi, and in the 2nd week we are looking at the modernization theory through the lens of Theodor Sanin. Okay. In the last class, if you slightly recall, we have discussed in the context of Sanin's class state and revolution, how the radical upsurge of 1968 and its aftermath, in terms of the nature of revolution, the tactics of revolutionary struggles, the strategies of revolutionary struggles and so on, and the Vietnam War during and after 1968, a search for the agencies of revolutionary change and an analysis of the impediments that provided the crux of a threefold debate in the form of prospects of revolution and the search for a revolutionary class. 1. 2. Revolutionary organizations and their relation to the classes or masses, and 3. State and revolution, the nature of the state in societies where revolutions have been contained, where revolutionaries challenge the state, and in societies within which a revolution becomes institutionalized. Then we have discussed the political context of alternatives to modernization theory through the lens of Theodor Sanin. The 1968 Vietnam, France, US, China and Czechoslovakia, death of Che and Allende in Latin American backward of the United States, crimes and casualties of the world's many establishments, inadequacies of theoretical thought, both from the left and right alike, the 1968 wave of radicalism, the split between the Soviet Union, the erstwhile Soviet Union on the one hand and the People's Republic of China on the other, about the nature of revolutions, about the revolutionary tactics and revolutionary strategies, and the economic crisis in the West, cultural revolution in China, and the impact of the organization of petroleum export countries OPEC. Then we have discussed how the reconsideration of established concepts in the light of the new, often non-European developments lies at the core of the post-1968 debate. There we have discussed the early 1970s about revolutionary classes and revolutionary perspectives, such argument that unfolded within the basic framework of the Marxist tradition, a common commitment to change aimed at abolishing the social base of exploitation and domination. That's how I quoted Wordsworth, "Have I not reason to lament what man has made of man?" That's what Wordsworth wrote in lines written in early spring in 1798. The joy that man perceives in the natural world and his belief that his own soul is somehow intimately connected to that joy leads Wordsworth to mourn what man has made of man. In other words, the cruelty, selfishness and fighting that characterize humanity. While humans are essentially part of nature, they certainly do not act that way. Then we have discussed there was acceptance of a sociological perspective whose major components are the determining impact of political economy and of class conflict within social structure, acceptance of revolutionary violence as the probable and indeed usual, though not obligatory, way of bringing about the necessary social changes, and at this point, however, paths began to diverge, whether it is the peasantry or the established industrial working class. Okay? That is why Sanin made this point very striking, the empirical peasantry and the hypothetical proletariat. Okay? Hypothetical proletariat means the industrial working class. Okay? Then we have discussed how the third world is the area where revolutionary conditions are ripe and where revolutions which might develop into socialist ones are in the cards. The industrial working class is increasingly diversified in numbers and sunk in a complacency derived in part from the benefits of the imperial spoils. The main weight of global capitalist exploitation falls most heavily upon the developing societies, in particular on the peasants and the urban poor of peasant background, who together form the major oppressed classes in less developed countries. The established industrial working class in less developed countries has been privileged in relation to the peasant majority, the poorest urbanites and the unemployed. The established working class is also small in numbers and will remain so until the imperialist controls that result in underdevelopment are broken. Therefore, the masses in the exploited dependencies, the underprivileged classes, the peasants, the urban poor and the workers, plus perhaps also the intelligentsia, teachers, students, right, which constitute a force in the global capitalist system that is revolutionary in the sense Marx considered the proletariat of the early period of modern industrialization to be revolutionary. And against this, others stuck to the more orthodox Marxist guns, that the most advanced technology, the centers of power and knowledge which lie in the industrialized societies, and it is therefore from there that socialism has to be established around the globe. It is the social character of the industrial working class, its unity on the soft floor, its skills acquired in dealing with advanced technology, its size, its propertylessness and its explicit relations of conflict with the capitalists, which make it into the most revolutionary, indeed the only revolutionary and socialist class of our times. Some of the very premises of the comparison were spurious, I mean whether orthodox Marxism or the kind of neo-Marxism that we tend to witness. The peasants of the proletarianists' argument often seem realistic enough. They are images backed by political experience and study, and it is the image of the proletariat that has remarkably little to do with the actual life of the contemporary working class in industrialized capitalist societies. Indeed, the more one tries to match the real working class with its hypothetical model, the more the model looks either prehistoric, that is irrelevant to our times, or ahistoric, that is utopian. And it is this hypothetical proletariat, it is this industrial working class that outstrips real peasants in its revolutionary and socialist potential. And then we have discussed political characteristics of empirical peasants with those of empirical industrial workers, rather than attempting to deduce them from a historico-philosophical theory whose supreme virtue that consists of being supra-historical. In this supra-historical, I am borrowing this term from Marx, who when he suggested that, I mean supra-historical, the meaning of this term is which goes beyond history, ahistorical. Okay? And then we have discussed how peasants in their political struggles tend to fight for land rather than for broader political aims, to be preoccupied with local day-to-day concerns rather than with general long-term aims and complex ideologies. The industrial working class develops nationwide class consciousness and class organization, consequently a class for itself, while the peasants remain disunited and politically naive. Then we have discussed how the peasants do not control their leaders, they are the object and tool rather than the subject of political action. And then we have we stopped here in at this point the empirical peasantry and the hypothetical proletariat, so far as the relationship between class state and revolution is concerned. Now we are going to move on to model and context of class state and revolution, and then we will discuss the epiphenomenal state and the substitute bourgeois, and then we will discuss class and classness, and then we will discuss today permanent vanguard and revolutionary class, and then we will end with substitutes and realities. To start with model and context, during the 1968 wave of revolutionary optimism, the discussion on revolution tended naturally to focus on the revolutionary army, that is, on those who are or may become revolutionaries. It usually underestimated the intrinsic power of the systems of social domination to mobilize resources, to manipulate and to readjust. Those capacities are not only immense but still growing, and a more realistic way of putting the question is, how do revolutions take place and succeed at all, rather than, this is important, how do revolutions take place and succeed at all, rather than why do revolutions not take place more frequently? This is not a pertinent question, but how do revolutions take place and succeed at all, that is more important. Lenin, who was well versed in the practice, theory and art of revolution, reminded us that there are two sides to the equation in his remark that revolutions occur when neither the ruled nor the rulers are able to go on living in the old way. That is true, but it needs further specification. If we define successful revolution as a leap, as a quanta transformation, quantum jump involving massive popular intervention in social structure, property relations, systems of domination, class divisions, typical forms of cognition, the transformation of the state and the removal of its rulers, then the processes that preceded and led to revolution have in the 20th century universally displayed four major characteristics. Then what are those four major characteristics? One, a major crisis causing severe dislocation of society and its day-to-day functioning. Two, a major crisis of the governing elite affecting its ability to govern. Three, a crystallization of classes and subclasses expressed in a sharp way, increase in self-identification, organization and militancy along class lines. And four, an effective revolutionary organization providing leadership in the political struggle. A heuristic model would have to recognize that while each of these elements is partly determined by the other three, each must also be analyzed on its own terms, that is, its own specific characteristics and dynamics. Revolutions, moreover, are always critically embedded in an international context. Okay, both national as well as international context, relevant and often decisive for their outcome. In the most politically direct and analytically trivial sense, foreign intervention can preclude revolution or defeat it. It can also promote it and at the same time accelerate it. More significant, if contradictory, is the long-term impact of the world economy and polity reflected in the fact that all of the internally generated and successful revolutions of the 20th century and partly 21st century have occurred in the type of societies we call developing societies. Okay. That is why developing societies at the less developed countries. When I say I mean developing societies, I mean societies at the underprivileged pole in a world capitalist system of inequalities, with consequences of for important features of their internal structures that indicates a particular kind of state, a particular kind of class system and a particular kind of revolution. Okay. In this sense, we are using the term developing societies or less developed countries, that refers to societies at the underprivileged pole in a world capitalist system of inequalities, uneven distribution of wealth and resources. Okay? Precisely because of the narratives that we have built over a period of time and across space on anti-colonial thought processes. That is very important. If we leave out colonialism, if we leave out imperialism, perhaps it will be extremely difficult on our part to situate the history of sociology of development in India, in Indian context. Look at Africa also. South Africa was also colonized for a long period of time. Okay? Now coming to the relationship between class state and revolution, I mean the epiphenomenal state and the substitute bourgeois. I mean when I say epiphenomenal state, I mean at times it becomes an insubstantial epiphenomenon. Even in fact when Marx was writing ideologies in general and the German ideologies and the German ideology in particular, he emphatically mentioned what are ideologies. Marx as a theoretician, not Marx as an ideologue of the Communist Party, but what are ideologies for Marx as a theoretician. For Marx as a theoretician, ideologies are fantasies, myths, inverted images, echoes of material life and so on. On the whole, it is an insubstantial epiphenomenon. Now the state has become an epiphenomenon, and that is why to return to the four-pronged model that we started with, the build up to a revolutionary situation entails the societal crisis that stops or impedes the functioning of structures of domination as well as day-to-day social life, a situation in which society fails to deliver the goods, a major economic collapse or a military defeat are the principal obvious cases. The importance of functional breakdown on this scale lies in the impossibility of resolving it by resorting to the coercive and manipulative responses that are effective in a social system that operates as usual. Only circumstances of the most extreme kind will induce masses of people to engage in a head-on clash with the powers that be and to endangering safety, livelihoods and lives. And that is how secondly revolutionary situations and prospects, revolutionary prospects reflect the nature and dynamics of the rulers and in particular the conditions under which the governing elite loses its grip. And this deterioration of the ability to govern does not come about simply as a result of an increase in the pressure of revolutionary forces and or a general social crisis, but has its own partly autonomous logic. The weakness or decline of the dominant class and or of its direct links with the governing elite are contributory. But once again, a crisis of governing cannot be reduced to a crisis of class hegemony. That's very important. A crisis of governing cannot be reduced to a crisis of class hegemony. The issue of state and revolution, okay, the issue of state and revolution relates the two major conceptual clusters, okay, that what are those two major conceptual clusters? Now, one is this, that the build up to a revolutionary situation which entails a societal crisis that stops or impedes the functioning of structures of domination as well as day to day social life, a situation in which society fails to deliver the goods, a major economic collapse or a military defeat. Okay? And secondly, revolutionary situations and prospects that reflect the nature and dynamics of its rulers, and in particular the conditions under which the governing elite loses its grip. Okay? The contemporary state is the principal machinery of social domination and ordering, which links territorially delimited and hierarchically organized social structures with the social groups which govern them. Laymen and scholars alike, they share the assumption of the state's exceptional significance as the major unit of institutionalized and monopolized power, day-to-day administrative and enforcement procedures, economic action, identification, political mobilization, legitimation and social reproduction in its broadest sense. A revolution is necessarily a war against the state. The basic question of every revolution is that of state power. A successful revolution is first of all a victory over the state and its transformation. At the core of Marxist tradition lies a challenge to the liberal belief in the parliamentary state as a simple tool for managing society, serving everybody's interest evenly within the framework of a social contract between rational equals and or as a neutral computer like mediator of class interests. The principal alternative view offered by Marx and Engels, I mean the alternative to liberal view, that the principal alternative was to offered by Marx and Engels was to approach the state as a tool of class domination, an executive committee of the ruling class, and in their work and that of their successors, notably Kautsky and Lenin, the very existence of the state was seen as the product of the irreconcilable nature of conflict in class society and was therefore limited to class societies. Cases in which those who made and managed society did not directly express the will of the dominant class or even challenge it, such as under absolutism or Bonapartism, were explained by the transitional balance of class forces that made for the relative autonomy of the state administration, enabling it to play a balancing role. The autonomy was always restricted in the long run by the interests of the dominant classes. An attempt by Bukharin to ask that what the new phenomenon of an increasingly interventionist state might mean for the Marxist theory of the state was rapidly forgotten. Only recently have new conceptualizations of the state emphasizing its relative autonomy been developed in the work of Marxist analysts. These come increasingly to stress the institutional materiality of the state, its role in recognizing the power block of class forces and its economic functions. If you look at this then to the Marxist tradition, the post-colonial state has offered therefore a significant analytical change. These states seem to have been parachuted by colonial rule and then taken over lock, stock and barrel, that is in their territorial claims, administration and legal structures by independence movements. A dominant class in this classical capitalist sense of control over the means of production, clearly distinct from the management of the state, often did not seem to exist to any significant extent. The first serious Marxist conceptualization of the special characteristics of such states was offered by the term overdeveloped state. Overdeveloped, that is, with respect to its imported characteristics and as against the relative underdevelopment of its indigenous class structures. And in that view, while a state's origins might be colonial, its actual power base and its relative autonomy rested on a new class of balance between the metropolitan bourgeois, which retained its influence, the local bourgeois and the local landlords, who together constituted the dominant class coalition. A much cruder one-dimensional version was also offered, in which the power base of such a state was seen simply to be reflected power and interest of neocolonialism. The state within developing societies was merely the local executor of the multinationals and the metropolitan rule, a foreign police force speaking the native tongue. There is no doubt of the major importance of the insights of Marxist analysis, classical as well as new. The functioning of the state as a repressive power in the service of the propertied classes, its role in developing societies as a local partner of the multinationals, and the way confrontations and balances of class forces structure and underlie the organization of state power. However, this is an incomplete model, and the experience of developing societies offers a significant reason why this should be so. In most Marxist analysis, the state is treated as epiphenomenal, okay? Of reflection of underlying class forces, local and foreign, and the setting for their interplay, a conceptual equivalent of the class neutral state of pluralist theories of society, which acts as a management computer. Alternatively, the state is seen as an expression of the structural needs of capital accumulation only. The determinative capacity of the state to shape and reshape society is dismissed or passed over in silence via the conceptual reduction of the state to its assumed class dimensions and or the functional needs of capital, or the impact of imperialism and or the inertia of the past class and colonial rule. Within the pluralist paradigm, as you notice, a similar reduction of the state to a vector of influences, factors, needs and rational arguments take place. Even the very possibility of considering the opposition between the state and dominant classes is at times removed altogether by an image of a state fully tailored to class needs. There are three fundamental deficiencies in such a line of thought. Okay. First, while states can be shown to be shaped, produced and determined by class interests and action, they have also produced class structures, transformed them or made them disappear, as when a bourgeois or a peasantry has been created by a deliberate state policy. Look at the cases of Kenya or Pakistan and so on, Tanzania, Brazil. Nor has this happened only in states of the capitalist era. In the China of Qin Shi in the 3rd century BC, to cite one example, a state initiated agrarian reform effectively abolished the rural proletariat cum serf classes that the polarization and debt enslavement of the peasantry had created, returning China to square one, that is, to a gigantic system of smallholder agriculture serving the imperialist interest a revolution from above in clear contradiction to the immediate interests of the dominant class of the large landowners. Both of the possible routes of determination must then be considered. Secondly, the state is treated as if it operated outside the context of political economy, a laissez-faire utopia that still colors economics as a discipline. Laissez-faire means non-interference, non-interventionist state. A model of or a mode of analysis that focuses on political economy and defines it as a social production and reproduction, making use of human labor through the control of the means of production to produce surplus value, applies to also the contemporary state. The state operates within the economy in two ways. One, it works indirectly through taxation, monopolies, monetary policies, the national debt, employment patterns of spending and welfare services, a point increasingly incorporated in the theoretical fold. In all those ways, in the policy making process, structures economic life and redistributes surpluses which service social functioning. The reproduction of social relations and social control, as well as passing on costs to the taxpayers, without which the whole contemporary process of capitalist profit making would not work. But the state does not just offer infrastructure to support or simply reproduce the necessary conditions for capitalism to flourish. It simultaneously operates as a major capitalist enterprise or holding company in the direct sense of creating surplus value, cooperating and at times competing with national and multinational capital, aiming at the control of labor, the maximization of profits and the securing of their privileged use for its personal, that is for a specific social group. A state bourgeois, according to some, a technocracy to others, and an entrepreneurial bureaucracy to yet others. Okay? When whatever term, whether it is technocracy or state bourgeois or entrepreneurial bureaucracy, whatever term that one wants to use, the content indicates a social category with specific corporate interests, a position within the process of production, control of surpluses and strategies of its own. The state and its managers are a politico-economic force in terms of resources, production, power, surpluses and personnel, quite apart from the extra economic power which they wield. And in developing societies, you will find that the scope of state economy broadens so that typical examples of it would include not only state-owned factories and mines, but also state monopolies such as the state boards controlling main export crops. Look at the case of coffee in Ghana or cotton in the Sudan, which are bought and extracted cheaply from their producers to be sold dearly on international markets, with the remainder siphoned off for the maintenance of the privileged state apparatus. Such monopolies add an important exploitative dimension, a gigantic dispersed manufacture in Marxist sense, the socio-economic equivalent of an early bourgeois exploiting a smallholder economy. The ways in which any actually existing capitalism in a developing society is run depend upon the class struggle of exploited and exploiters, on the structural imperatives of capitalist profit making, and also on the confrontation and compromise within a triple alliance of local property owners, one, two, multinational companies, and three, those who control the state economy in its indirect and direct sense. The third fundamental deficiency, that is the state and state apparatus, are at times treated as two separate phenomena, and analytical distinction elevated into an assumed social reality. That is, the state is depicted as an abstraction of us all served by civil servants, while state apparatus simply serves its extra state masters, who are the only determinant of the political scene. The direct manifestation of the state is the state apparatus and analytical divisions apart. The one without the other belongs where disembodied spirits do. Marx's description adopted by Lenin of the organs of the state provides a good initial list of the bureaucratic core organizations, but also reflects that description's historicity and initial limitations. It included standing army, police, bureaucracy, clergy and judiciary. The necessary additions today would include the administrators of the economy, welfare, education, the mass media and possibly the ruling party. The last four, what I meant, administrators of the economy, welfare, education, the mass media and possibly the ruling party, you will find arguably exchangeable for the clergy of Marx's designation. The first is notably absent in his list, the administrators of the economy. The sum total of the organs is a symbol of controls, legitimation and privileges, but also of human beings organized, selected and reproduced according to partly autonomous rules. To a great extent, the social reality and materiality of the state lie here. Furthermore, the bureaucratic system of hierarchical supervision and promotion means the concentration of power in the hands of a relatively small group with its specific characteristics, internal life, the potential for interchange between its different sectors, ideological patterns and consciously established strategies, a governing elite in direct control of the state apparatus. The term elite in this sense has often been challenged, especially by Marxists, and is often treated as an eclectic admixture that threaten verbal orthodoxies. It has some considerable limitations which must be kept in mind, but it is still the only term for which no substitute as yet exists, one which denotes a real enough social phenomenon, that is the characteristics of a small internal linked group at the top of major bureaucratic structures and wielding power through them. Attempts to analyze developing societies have produced another image, one as unrealistic as the notion of the state as epiphenomenal state. It is the image of the state's total independence of and supremacy over the rest of the social matrix, that is a faith in the manipulative omnipotence of the state, typical of many modernizers of the 1950s and 1960s. International experience has since eroded much of the confidence that easy and quick solutions will result once the correct plan or advice has been adopted, and its twin belief that the failure of a strategy is simply the result of mistakes or treason. A revolution begins with an attack on the state or state apparatus. The very revolutionary situation is a consequence of the state's failure to contain revolutionaries, to manipulate or suppress opposition, to run its administration and economy. With a few exceptions, it also means the collapse of unified strategy and often of nerve at the top. What also seems to be necessary and often, what also seems to be necessary is the establishment of alternative political focuses of authority to those of the state. That is why a centerpiece of a revolutionary situation is the fragmentation of the governing process, which challenges the state's monopoly of it in what Trotsky called dual power and Charles Tilly refers to us as a situation of multiple sovereignties. A political and ideological base outside the spheres of domination and control by the organs of the state. The nature of so-called developing societies has accentuated some of the general aspects of state organization. The significance of the state economy and of the state bureaucracy are made more obvious by the weakness of the native bourgeois and or of the low classness or of the other social classes. The state is often the main employer and the main source of economic enterprise in what is at times referred to as state capitalism, a capitalist economy run by non-capitalists. It may mean a process of eventual transformation of state bureaucrats into capitalists. It is never only that the oppressive nature of state intervention through revolutions from above is particularly salient in developing societies. So are the exceptionally high levels of exploitation and social polarization. The special political characteristics, I mean the military regime's brutality of oppression and instability are not an aberration, but reflect the specific nature of the state in developing societies. The less secure is control, the more visible the oppressive nature of the state. The social structure of developing societies, they are characteristically uneven development, the disarticulation between aspects of social and economic structures, the relatively weak domination of the ruled by the rulers, I mean with the ruled excluded from political life rather than politically incorporated, and the immense concentration of control at the top lead to rapid and erratic changes within the political elite. Okay? I mean plots, coups, coup d'etat, assassinations and so on. The revolutionary organization, weak as it may be, faces a political elite, a state and a dominant class that prove even weaker. The politics of global dependency, the class nature of developing societies and the character of the state in these societies explain why every successful self-generated revolution for more than a century has taken place in a developing society. Okay? That is why it is very important to understand the significance of the revolutionary prospects and the search for revolutionary class in a developing society. Okay? And India is no exception to this. Now, we will move to class, state and revolution through the lenses of class and classness. Within the major European tradition of class analysis, what you will find that social classes are treated as the major subgroups of contemporary society, defined by their common basic interests and their position in the system of political economy, expressed in a distinctive consciousness and shaped by conflict relations with other classes. The most illuminating aspect of this analysis lies in its insights concerning the relation between the objective and the subjective in political action. Group interest and group consciousness are mediated by social conflict, which leads to the crystallization of a class as a recognizable and self-recognized entity, that is a class for itself. That is why I have mentioned a transition from class in itself to a class for itself. It implies also that the revolutionary character of a social class is historical, that is relative and changing, insofar as a class in its full meaning is defined as a self-conscious social category rooted in the wage political economy works. We must assume and consider different and changing levels of its coherence and powers of determination. The problem is not only of class, but also the extent of classness. The attempt to pinpoint the revolutionary class of the 21st century has often rested on an analogy that runs like this. Just as the bourgeois overthrew feudalism with the advance of the new and more plentiful forces of production, so will the proletariat in due time overthrow capitalism and build a new world in its own image, that is a classless society. Both the metaphor and the extrapolation are wrong. Feudalism was not overthrown by its main class of exploited producers, that is the peasantry, but by classes representing new social characteristics and located in the relatively independent towns. That was of course also true in the past. It took Stalin's brazen illiteracy to claim that a slave revolt overthrew Rome. Okay? That was not correct. Okay? What Stalin meant. If an anti-feudal revolution is to be used as a model, that is to make a revolution, but I mean if is to model, if an anti-feudal revolution is to be used as a model, we would not look to the blue collars of today as the class that is to make a revolution. But analogies, right or wrong, do not validate theories. Their validation, such as it is, lies with analysis of reality. For example, Paul M. Swiji provided an analysis of the development and contemporary position of the working class that has been largely ignored. It deviates from the unidirectional interpretation of the Marxian class in itself, class for itself duality, suggesting instead a typical three-stage pattern of development. In the first stage, a conservative technology of a handicraft system, the manufacture was linked to an essentially conservative working class of assembled craftsmen. In the second stage, which Marx observed in England and France, a revolutionary breakthrough in technology and the new social relations introduced by industrialization gave rise to a massive and homogeneous proletariat, and the possibility that a powerful revolutionary push by them might result in a revolution. Nevertheless, when and if revolutions fail to mature, a new situation begins to develop. Okay? The tremendous rise in productivity means for the working class of contemporary industrial societies. Okay? All this together with increased social mobility implies that once again, as in the period of manufacture, the proletariat is highly differentiated, and once again occupational and status consciousness tend to submerge class consciousness. The significance of that historiography of the understanding of revolution is obvious. It makes sense of the influential socialist metaphor of the turn of the 20th century about a revolution moving east from England to France, then to Germany, then possibly to Russia, China and the Orient. By that token, workers of the developing societies, especially those in the industrialization upsurge as well as their opposite numbers within the socialist developing societies of today, would have the highest potential for revolutionary action. The scenario sounds realistic. What is of historical significance, or what is the historical experience of relevance for contemporary peasants? You can look at the Taiping revolt in the 19th century China. You can I mean the revolutionary potential of workers and peasants has often been debated. It may be useful to broaden that list when considering classes in terms of their historical promise for revolutionary action. One should remember first a variety of other class-like entities referred to, maybe strata, different strata, groups, subclasses and so on. You can look at national and racial minorities, caste minorities, minorities on the basis of caste, race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, class and so on. And you can also look at when I said national and racial minorities, in some circumstances display patterns of political action that resemble the model of classes in themselves developing within systematic conflict into classes for themselves, especially when these are ethno-classes, that is groupings in which ethnic and class specificity are linked. And finally, a particularly important revolutionary role has been played by a number of transient social groups that show class-like characteristics, that is common interests, way of life, patterns of cognition and related self-consciousness that provide a class for basis for unity of political action. Okay? The very rise of such groups often reflects social crisis. Russian soldiers in the 1917-18 period, students of university campuses in some countries and periods, the city poor of Algeria's Kasbah of the 40s. You look at the students' upsurge in Indian context in the 21st century. This brings us to the issue of intellectuals who can be identified in terms of formal education, the role they play in the social division of labor, and the specialization of mental as against manual aspects of social production and reproduction. I mean, relation to means of production, what I mean here, that the basic yardstick of relation to production fails to identify intellectuals at all, and you will find that it is important to look at intellectuals in advanced capitalist countries as well as intellectuals in developing societies. And in this context, it would be incomplete if I do not mention the name of Antonio Gramsci, what he wrote in his present notebooks about organic intellectuals, the role of intellectuals in party building, in having rationalism, creative freedom, freedom to dissent and so on. Okay. Now we are coming to permanent vanguard and revolutionary class. I mean, the belief in the necessity of a revolutionary vanguard supreme to and apart from the class in cohesion, consciousness and organization yet related to it. Okay. I mean, this kind of permanent vanguard revolutionary class, when I say, you can look at the very idea of a vanguard constituted a basic revision of classical Marxism as expressed in the last section of the manifesto of the Communist Party, drafted by Marx and Engels, developed within the social context of Russia, the first developing society of the day, and under a highly oppressive regime, it grew out of a specific revolutionary experience. Gramsci's modern prince attempted to update this analysis of the more advanced, more complex, more democratic and more capitalist societies, an issue still very much under debate, indeed increasingly so. The class vanguard interdependence, that is the two last factors in the model of successful revolution suggested in the second that a model of successful revolution has been the centerpiece of the post-Marx new revolutionary experience. Its successes and failures, yet attempts to distill that experience have been remarkably limited, especially in so far as the comparative analysis of relevant evidence is concerned. Okay? You can look at party cadres organization, you can look at guided class action. I mean, revolutions may also be won through a guided class action in which a class is being led and controlled by a revolutionary elite of relative outsiders with their conceptions of reality, organization and corporate interests. Okay? Now, political success determines and at times misleadingly the ways we treat leaders, theories and theorists. Okay? That drives us to look at class, state and revolution in terms of substitutes and realities. You will look at Russian Soviet revolutionary changes starting from 1905 to 1917. It is the new in its global setting with characteristic class structures, forms of state organization and types of social crisis. It has been conceptualized by revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries alike in theoretical terms drawn from the past, mainly from Western and Central Europe in the 19th century, especially from the Parisian experience of 1848 and 1871, I mean Paris Commune, including Paris Commune 1871. All of the successful revolutionary leaders of the 20th century have fundamentally revised their views in the course of their political practice, but the theory of revolution on the part of practitioners and of social scientists alike has lagged behind. The main product of this lag has been conceptual blindness, in which social realism is systematically sacrificed to terms that mislead and run counter to the evidence, but fit grand theories and presupposed schemes. Thus, I mean that is the type of analysis in which illusionism is dressed up and comes to inhabit make-believe worlds, where a hypothetical proletariat in lieu of a revolutionary class, in lieu of a revolutionary class, or maybe you will find that make-believe world where a hypothetical proletariat, a non-existent peasantry and an intangible intelligentsia in lieu of a revolutionary class face an epiphenomenal state ruled by classes that one cannot find, or by a military dictatorship treated as bourgeois, an unending chain of mystifications. At the roots of the contemporary debate among socialists about classes, states and revolutions lies this tendency towards reification that we have discussed earlier, that reification refers to the process where you will find that where the result of our actions appears to us as a quasi-natural thing or object or matter, precisely because we simply do not recognize the social origins or the processes which have gone into its formation. Okay, that's why I said at the roots of the contemporary debate among socialists about classes, states and revolutions lies this tendency towards reification and verbal substitution, posing as radical theory. To confront it not only clears the air for realistic analysis, but serves socialism as well. But what about a socialist revolution? Its initial success would carry the characteristics of revolutions discussed, whatever its additional qualities might be. Next, at the risk of sounding tautological, the only irreplaceable and absolutely necessary element in socialist revolution, in the light of the past experiences, are the socialists who execute it. How? Their commitment, their ability to see reality and their capacity to build up powerful mass alliances using every crack in the social system of domination and exploitation. Furthermore, the class nature of the revolutionary agencies of change necessarily differs between the initial stage of the struggle against the pre-revolutionary state and the periods that follow. The most severe of all the problems of socialist revolution has proven to be not how to make it, but how to keep it socialist, in the sense that word carries in the socialist classics. We seem to have learnt that Delhi invariably taken by surprise. In real terms, we still know very little about the social mechanisms operating within revolutionary states and or societies ruled by socialists, yet that is the crux of the matter insofar as socialist revolution is concerned. And moreover, realistic analysis of post-revolutionary societies is necessary if we are to understand and demystify issues like state, class, part, planning or social transformation in the non-socialist developing societies too. To conclude this week's lectures, for socialists, the suggested analysis calls not for conceptual evacuation of the social battlefields by the working class and or consequent despair, but rather the recognition that the industrial working class was never innately and eternally placed there. Class militancy is relative, and this goes for every class in historical reality. simple solutions do not work. A proletarian revolution does not necessarily produce socialism, nor does socialism equal proletariat rule. The laws of motion and the unfolding crisis of capitalism on a world scale are central to any analysis of the possibility of socialism and explain the constant challenge of revolutionary forces, but that does not mean that this will result in an inevitable grand finale with an optimistic and rational outcome. Socialism is not some imminent promise or law of nature, but a possibility, something to be fought for. The first view might be anxiety reducing, but the second is more realistic. It implies that socialists will not have socialism delivered to them by laws of history or natural revolutionary classes or their substitutes, but will have to rely heavily on themselves, their own militancy, their readiness to make sacrifices, and not least their capacity to understand the world they live in and to offer alternatives that will work both as revolutions and as socialist societies. That is precisely what makes realistic analysis more politically relevant than the histrionics of propaganda, even for the best causes. It means that the struggles for social justice, the specific social context of the developing societies will be particularly important. It finally implies that the struggle for socialism is going to be more complex, more difficult and more bitter than our predecessors expected, and that defeat is also possible. Okay? That is what Sanin tries to conclude, and we have come to the closure of the fifth week we have come to the closure of 5 weeks in this of this course. What we have discussed, Sanin's important contribution to the relationship between class, state and revolution through the empirical peasantry, and it started with the political context, the empirical peasantry and the hypothetical proletariat, then model and context, then the epiphenomenal state and the substitute bourgeois, then class and classness, and then permanent vanguard and revolutionary class, and substitutes and realities. And in the next week, we are going to discuss the third part of the modernization theory. Thank you.